forgot to start recording this earlier. We also see that we see the love of God often in the New Testament, especially we see that through Christ. We see that God is certainly very relational. We see his mercy. We also see the heart. And so there are individuals who emphasize or reflect God's image in terms of processing things more morally, but we also see individuals who process things more relationally, which has more to do with emotions, feelings, and acceptance, things of that nature. And you can probably look in the mirror. Actually, you don't even have to look in the mirror, but you can probably just think of yourself and think, well, how do I tend to process things? Do I tend to process things more through, what's right and wrong? Do I tend to process things more through relational? Now, I think more counselors tend to be more relational than moral, but that isn't completely, completely. It's not 100% either or in either direction. So, with looking at this counseling model, I'm calling it the image model, or I3, and essentially these are some things behind there. Number one is this: we're created in God's image, of course, that we reflect God's moral and relational aspects, and it's reflected in how we interpret the world. That is how we think through and process words or actions and relationships, and as well as how we interact with the world as well, in terms of what we say and do. Typically, we reflect more one side than the other side. And of course, this is going to impact our relationships in terms of what we understand, in terms of communication, in terms of conflict, in terms of how we relate to each other. And you probably find out that typically, if you're married and you're more of a relational person, there's probably a good chance that you're married to someone who's more of the moral processor. If you're more of a moral processor, chances are you're related or you're married to someone who's more relational or more attracted to someone who tends to be kind of the opposite of that. But ultimately, in looking at this model in counseling, it's looking at we might recognize, okay, if we might process things through the moral lens, we might process things through a relational lens. However, our goal essentially is to become like Christ, who's fully in God's image. And so we might reflect one more than the other, but we want to become mostly like Christ, who is full of grace and truth. So here are some descriptions of what a relational processor or a moral processor may be. The moral processor, again, looking more at Old Testament law, more looking at right and wrong, looking through things, it's kind of black and white. There's not much of a gray area. Some of the buzzwords in Scripture that really they can relate to are truth, holiness, obedience, law, justice. And what's important to their lives, and they process things through this way, is fairness. Things have to be fair. And if things are not fair, then of course, they're unfair, they're not fair. And if they're not fair, then that's wrong, that's bad. Especially when we think about raising kids that way. It's not fair. And of course, life is not fair. So deal with it, kid. But there is a sense of where that really bothers a person if something is just not fair. They typically, what's important too is judgment. Again, you reap what you sow, you get what you deserve. Someone who's a moral processor will also look at tangible rewards and consequences. Because in thinking about the law is about obedience and doing. And so you have to do it. But they tend to be more concrete. And so being more concrete are things that have to be more tangible, more things that you can do with your hands or use with your hands or things of that nature. A lot of the focus is on the fruit and the actions as opposed to the heart. The heart is difficult because these are intangible things. Emotions are intangible. You can't hold on to it. It's more abstract. Emotions are, you just can't grab a hold of it. They're hard to make sense of. But also in the moral processor too, you get what I'm calling top-down thinking. So what top-down thinking is it starts with a certain standard. And the standard is whatever that might be. And then they make comments based on that standard. which of course a relational person is gonna think is complete criticism, and they're being critical and putting other people down. They're putting me down, but they typically start at whatever that standard is. And so I'm watching. One of my sons is more of a black and white thinker, and so we're watching an Eagles game, of course, right? And while we're watching the Eagles game, like he can be very critical, and the reason that he's very critical is he's got starts at that perfection aspect. It says this is what they should do. You know, every play should go great. Every play should work. Every play should have this expectation. And if they don't make it, they stink. They're horrible. They're terrible, kind of thing. And so it starts at the top. It doesn't meet the standard, and then they make comments on that. Emotions. They see emotions and feelings as just kind of getting in the way. But oftentimes, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but oftentimes emotions and feelings, they're kind of processed to a single emotion, that things are simplified. If someone's like a black and white thinker, everything is simplified. There's no gray area. It's either this or this. There is no in between. And oftentimes moral processors tend to be attracted to, I guess, anger, actually, because anger is making a moral judgment upon something that you know is wrong. And because they think and they process as right and wrong, then they'll can often go to anger and just kind of stay there because they make a moral judgment on something that it's wrong. But moral processors also look at things is that because they have that standard aspect, they want to be able to meet that standard. And so you might have had a boss in the past, or you might be a boss, you know, in your other position, or you might have had a teacher that is really good with working on processes and procedures. And so as they're working on processes and procedures, they're all on top of that. They can lead people to make sure that they take care of details and cover all the bases, you know, dot your I's, cross your T's. But when it comes to, and they'll motivate you to get it done, but it won't necessarily be a warm and fuzzy motivation. It will be essentially, you know, get this done. You need to get this done. And they're probably very good with quality control things, but they can also, again, appear very critical because if you're not meeting that standard, then obviously there's something wrong with you. So, but when we think of moral processors, you know, those are some things that are, you know, that are called value neutral, whether someone's content thinking or focus on fruit and actions, tangible rewards and these are not all bad things. There are some bad things there, but there are, but again, but moral processors, you know, they themselves are not bad or evil, you know, especially if, I really can't say that because my wife tends to be more of a moral processor, so I can't say that she's bad or evil. But I tend to be the relational processor. Now, a relational processor kind of looks more at the New Testament grace as opposed to the Old Testament law. They tend to be relational, emotional. They tend to be more feelings driven. And the key words in Scripture are grace, love, compassion, and mercy. These are some big words there. Now, what's important or emphasized essentially in a relational processor is this: is relationships, intimacy, and closeness. This is really important. And of course, intimacy is found by when you tell each other, you know, their feelings or your emotions. And if I can tell my emotions and feelings, you can tell me your emotions and feelings and thoughts, and then we're close. Now, the more now, if a relational processor is in a relationship with a moral processor, the more extreme that they are on one side, then the more difficult, because they're hardly ever going to talk about their feelings or emotions and things like that. What's also important or emphasized is mercy and grace, intangible rewards or consequences. That basically means, you know, pride or feeling good about something, or, you know, it's not money, it's not, you know, other kinds of rewards. It's just, you know what, I know I'm doing the right thing. A lot of you are being counselors. You really, you know, it's just like, hey, I'm counseling because I know it's good, I know it's right, but it's really, when we get that feeling, that emotion, when we see people's light bulbs turn on, you know, it's just such an amazing thing, and that is a reward in itself, which means that we're actually going to lower all your paychecks because the intangible rewards is all that matters. No, I'm just messing with you. But there's a focus on the heart, emotions, desires, again, more abstract thinking. Instead of a top-down thinking, it's really more of a side-by-side thinking. And the side-by-side thinking is really kind of a coming alongside, coming beside the person, being equal, and just kind of helping the other person out. Because relationships, again, are most important. Emotions and feelings are a priority, and they also can be emotive, and they like cooperation, essentially. We like to cooperate with other people. Now, I've got two sons. My one son is a black and white thinker, or a moral processor. My other son is more of a relational processor. And they went on a youth retreat not too long ago. And on the youth retreat, they had they did a lot of sports together, and there was this whole I think it was like a volleyball tournament. And my one son, who is my black and white thinking, my moral processing child, said the tournament was horrible because it was disorganized, and they didn't know how to make a bracket. They had teams playing teams that shouldn't have been playing. The reffing wasn't good, and so all of this stuff, he's complaining about this because things were not done the right way. Things were not done a good way. It was just it ended up not being very fair. So when thinking about that, all that tournament, he's like, it stunk because it wasn't done the right way. Now, look, my other son, on the other hand, was talking about the volleyball tournament, and he didn't really recognize hardly any of that stuff. He recognized it, but it didn't matter. He said that he had a good time, and because he was able to just spend a lot of time with a lot of people, he was able to get to meet people, and he just tends to be more of that relational processor. He sees things through the relational lens as opposed to the moral lens, and that that just emphasizes or shows just one of the difference of how two people who process things, who have a different lens, can look at the same thing and see completely different things. Is because, well, they're different, and God created them very differently. Now, it's not a horrible thing to be a relational processor, but relational processors do have their weaknesses, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's not a terrible thing to be a moral processor either. Both of these aspects reflect God. But the further we go, then it's kind of makes it worse. So let me look at a few things here. Some strengths and weaknesses about the moral processor. Now, if you're familiar with personality testing, you'll see a moral processor or a moral lens has more of a type A personality. You'll see that they're more choleric or melancholic when looking at those personality tests. And when thinking about those let's see, the choleric or melancholic, I'm going to, let's see, where is my, melancholic has to do with perfectionist, and they're more perfectionist, right? So they see the standard, and they can be self-deprecating or critical of others, or choleric. Some are choleric too, that they like to be in control of situations. They like to be on the top and the best. Again, they have that. Again, it has to do with that standard that they have. And again, the more intense it is, you see here at the bottom here, it says most bullies are choleric, but few cholerics are bullies. Some will actually stand up to them because they know what's right and they know what's wrong too. So it has a lot to do with whatever morals are out there. We also see too that if we look at the Myers-Briggs testing, you see that they're more sensing or judging or thinking as well. And in the more Myers-Briggs, you see sensing has to do with focusing, sensing about the material in a detailed and sequential manner. They often attend to what is occurring in the present and can move to the abstract after they experience concrete. Some can, some can't. But they're also more thinking, which is about objective truth and logical principles and natural and deductive reasoning. We also have more of the judging, it's about organized and structured, be motivated to complete assignments in order to gain closure. So that's different again there, but a lot of that has to do with Just having everything right there, tangible, and getting tangible rewards too. Janet, would you be able to mute your mic? That might be on the right side. All right, thank you so much. We're not, oh, maybe. Okay, so when we're looking at the, all right, Mark, let's see. You guys see, let me hear.
Without screaming.
All right, I'm looking at, let's see. All right, Mark, you said you don't see the slides changing. Does anybody else, can you see the slides changing as they change?
No, mine stayed the same.
Okay, which slide are you on?
It says image i3 model.
The synopsis one?
The very first slide you had up is still up. It just
Oh,
says,
really?
yeah.
All right, how about now?
No. Oh, okay. I clicked on that part of the screen and it changed. So.
Ah. All right. Well, my greatest apologies. So I'm explaining this model to you, and you're not seeing it. So here's a lot of what I was talking about.
Okay, gotcha.
And thanks for letting me know. And I'm going to forward this to you guys too later on.
Okay, just changed to synopsis. Okay,
great. Yeah, I thought I had it so that it would go with my screen. But I guess it was not. Okay, so I apologize for that. So this is all stuff that I've talked about. Again, I'm just going to forward that to you. This is essentially what a lot of the model looks like. And I think we'll be able to see that this is where we are kind of right now. But this is kind of what that model kind of shows, is that you see that on the left-hand side, the moral processor, that's kind of the blue triangle, sideless triangle, and the relational process is more of the mauve triangle. And you can see that how they, we're not all one or not all the other, but oftentimes we're a mix in there, except for the extremes on the other ends. And then of course you also see the cross in there too, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in the future here. So right now I'm looking at the moral processor and looking at some strengths and weaknesses. So we see the similarities to personality testing of the day, but we also see some strengths, and we want to look at those strengths of the moral processors. We see that they're dedicated to the truth. Now, what truth might be the question. So if they're dedicated to the gospel truth, then that can be a very good thing. But they kind of have a tendency to take things very literally. So like take, for example, you take 1 Corinthians 7, and it's about the wife's body belongs to, they'll read that into the wife's body belongs to me, so therefore you have to do this because your body belongs to me, right? And so it takes a little, where pride can certainly get in the way. They can be concrete, which are good at numbers and facts. A lot of like engineers, mathematicians, a lot of times mechanics, that's very tangible things. They tend to be very good workers and very reliable as well. They can simplify decision making. So the emotions just don't get in the way. And sometimes that's a good thing. Now, it's not always a good thing, but it can be a good thing. And again, they're very good with processes and procedures, the what and the how to do things. And hopefully with patients, they can explain that and explain those things very well. Now, the weaknesses, of course, they can tend to be a little bit more literal. They don't really necessarily consider or understand feelings or motives, especially when thinking about close relationships. And so they probably, depending on how severe it might be, they might not understand the feelings and motives of the other person. They often refuse to deal with their own emotions because, again, the own emotions, that's abstract. Emotions are abstract. You can't really, you can't hold it. You can't touch it. You can't, it can't be right there in front of you. So it's just really, emotions can be very hard to deal with. And not only their own, but it's hard to deal with other people's emotions. So what they do is they refuse to deal with it. And oftentimes, again, they simplify that into maybe just one emotion of anger. especially more for the extreme moral processors. They can be critical and judgmental. Again, all black and white, there's no gray area. When it comes to close relationships, again, depending on how severe it is, there might not be a lot of intimacy in that. And the decision-making processes that they have sometimes, again, depending on the severity, can be made too simple. So it's not just about right or wrong. What about, we have to consider emotions and feelings, and to do that, we want to have compassion and everything too. When we look at scripture, I think Saul is probably the most popular moral processor that there was, who later became Paul. And if we look at his background, we see that he was circumcised on the 8th day, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews, regards to the law, Pharisee, for zeal, persecuting, and righteous based on the law. So he was pretty much raised in that society of right and wrong. And so he very much was in that place. He was educated in the law, and so we see a lot of the law again there. I think Peter, himself, he was probably a moral processor as well. He spoke his mind. He didn't really care what other people thought until the denial. I think he was fearful of his life, but he seemed like an independent guy. And so I think that these two individuals were kind of moral processors. I'm sure there's a lot more in scripture, but these are two that just kind of came to my mind. On the other side, though, more relational processors, again, if we're looking at personality tests of this day, they're more likely to be that type B personality, or phlegmatic, sanguine, and according to the Myers-Briggs, their intuition, feeling, and perceiving. And let's see. And so when we look at the intuition, we see intuition is, let me see if I can get, insight is valued higher than careful observation. So insight, which again, it's a very abstract thing, and pattern recognition occurs. Okay, so they're more feeling. Feeling types place an emphasis on issues and causes them to be personalized while they consider other people's motives. So again, taking things, possibly a little bit more personal with those things. Again, perceiving, they're stimulated by new and exciting ideas. They like to be on time. Perceiving types might procrastinate. And the reason that they might procrastinate is because, we do things when we feel like doing them. And a lot of times, those individuals, relational individuals, they might actually create a crisis because they never feel like doing something. So therefore, procrastination is really good, because then it creates a sense of urgency so that things will get done, because otherwise they're not going to feel like doing it. But their feelings and emotions are very important. They're empathetic, they're compassionate, tend to be more. Closeness, there's more closeness in relationships, and then generally they're likable people. I had mentioned in my last blog, there was a teacher, and I had a 4th grade teacher, and my 4th grade teacher, she was a complete black and white thinker. She would try to motivate you by criticizing you, because again, looking at from that top down, thinking that if you don't meet the standard, then there's critical to meet that spot. So I used to forget my math homework, so she would become critical and call me Forgetful Fred. Now I still need counseling for that, but I'm still working through that. But on the other hand, my 6th grade teacher was complete opposite. She was a very relational person. And she would come beside you, she would walk beside, she would encourage, she would just kind of believe in you, per se. And so with that it worked a lot better on me than say calling me names kind of thing. But the relational processor too has some weaknesses. And again, these weaknesses occur more so the further you get away from the cross. So some of these are is that the emotions or feelings might actually become truth. I feel like this is true, so therefore I'm going to believe it's true. We see actually a lot of this in the church. We see it with homosexuality too, because even with homosexuality, that it's like, oh no, that in Scripture, in the Bible, Jesus is all about love and love, and we need to love other people, and so let's love them. And it's wrong to say that someone's not included. It's wrong to say that something is wrong. So which in itself is an interesting statement. And so therefore, often a lot of churches allow homosexuals with active homosexuals within the church, and they don't have a problem with it because love trumps truth, essentially. God's truth takes a back seat to what we feel is right. They're more likely to be emotionally sensitive and to take offense at things, to feel that rejection. More likely to be people pleasers too. Now, and some of you know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm talking about. And make decisions again based on feelings. And so therefore self-discipline can be a problem, can be an issue. Because if they don't feel like doing something, well, they're not going to do it. And let's see if I can. Okay. All right, so looking back there, we see those arrows that are pointed outside away from the cross. So the further away from, looking on the left side of with the moral processor, the further they are from that cross, that center area, the more right that they think they are. Therefore, there's like a big self-righteousness, essentially. The more to the away from the cross that they are, the more difficult relationships will be. The more one will be legalistic or be a Pharisee, and maybe the faith is more about religion. The more likely also that they'll be emotionally abusive, because emotions are irrelevant, or they have a hard time conceptualizing emotions or identifying with the emotions of their spouse, and they just will look at whatever is right and wrong, depending, again, how they see right and wrong. It might be their own right and wrong. It might be their own truth as opposed to God's truth. But when God's truth works for them, they may also, state that, like I did it with the 1 Corinthians 7 passage. But they're more likely to be emotionally abusive as well. And so we definitely want, or physically, or in any form. So we definitely want to look at that. But we also see the emotional or the relational processor too. The further away that they get from the cross, the further away they're also getting from truth. So the more right that they think they are, and of course there's a self-righteousness there. I think we're seeing a lot of that on the politics on the left-hand side. The more difficult also relationships will be because it's all about feelings, it's all about emotions. I remember this one woman that I was counseling. She was a little bit more towards that way, and she came to me and she said, well, I'm leaving my husband, and I think God thinks it's okay, and God will love me no matter what, and God's going to give me a new spouse who's going to love me and watch over me. And her husband was more of the moral processor, but I wouldn't say he was all the way over where he was an emotional abusive, but emotionally he wasn't really present. But this really woke him up, in which case he was moving along, but then again, that became too late. So she essentially said, forget about God's truth, or actually reinterpreted God's truth and just say, well, God is love, 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 love. So basically took advantage of God's grace. When looking at the more to the away from the cross, the more that they'll be swayed from God, they'll be moved by popular opinion or culture. The more likely also that they may be emotionally dependent upon someone as well. You might think of a stereotypical a young woman who has some issues that they've never felt love. Even thinking of the woman at the well being like that kind of person who became emotionally dependent on all these other guys and lived with them and had relations with them. Mostly because it wasn't about truth, it was just about how they felt. They never felt that love, so they tried to get it, and they looked for love in all the wrong places. So let me give you a few examples from Scripture. I want to do my best to, I'm kind of rushing through this without taking questions because I want to be mindful of your time to get done by 11. When we look at the prodigal of the parable son, the prodigal of the parable son, you like that? The parable of the prodigal son, and we see that the moral processing is like the older brother mentality. So when we think about that, we see that the younger brother did everything wrong, and the older brother, on the other hand, did everything right. And when the younger brother finally came back, The father, of course, welcomed him with open arms, went out to meet him, put the robe, the sandals, the ring, and threw a wild party, killing the fattened calf. And so the older brother is kind of looking at this and saying, what the heck? I've done everything right. I've done everything good. I've watched the fields. I've taken care of the animals. You just fill in the blank. He was a good, dutiful son, and he refused to celebrate, right? Because he was looking essentially at, these are my fruit and actions. My fruit and actions deserved something great, but here's my brother's fruit and actions, and he did all these horrible things, and he's getting what he doesn't deserve. And that's pretty much the whole point in the prodigal. In the story of the prodigal son, is that Jesus was speaking essentially to the Pharisees, to those who are kind of moralistic in their understanding of everything, and he was saying, listen, there's another law at play here. This is not just simply about the law of works. It's not about seeing things as just right and wrong. This is about relationship, and this is about that these are my people and I love them, and so yeah, I'm going to take them back, and they might not deserve it, but I love them, and I'm there for them, and I want to reestablish that relationship with them. If we think about the younger brother, in a sense, the younger brother kind of had a little bit of that moralistic attitude too, because when he was coming back, he was saying, well, he was working on the deserve system, which is I'm coming back and I don't deserve to be even called your son. Just hire me out as one of your hands. Right, and so that moralistic, area has a lot to do with that law and has a lot to do with what deserve. But we never know what the younger son did, except we know that he did receive the ring, and he did receive the robe and the sandals, and but that's all we hear. But imagine if he would have said, no, forget it. I deserve something worse, right? I deserve to be one of your servants, so I'm not going to accept your sonship. It shows the importance, again, of God's grace and about accepting God's grace as well. We also see the church of Thyatira. We, on the other end of the spectrum, that Jesus had many compliments for them. They loved each other. They had a lot of service to each other. They showed patience with one another. But he had this against them, that they allowed false doctrine in the church. In other words, they were all about love, which is wonderful, but they allowed false doctrine. So in other words, they got away from truth. They got away from the law. They got away from all of that. And that obviously was a huge problem. We also see in 1 Corinthians that there's sin in the church, and the church allowed sin. Again, they were loving each other, and they accepted it, and they actually even took pride in it, which is even worse. But they never confronted it, and they never confronted it with the truth. So when we look at scripture, we see words or instructions such as this: speak the truth in love. We actually see both aspects in there, right? Speak the truth is all about, those the concrete. It's about speaking God's truth. It's more on the moral aspect, but in love is everything that has to do with relational. Same thing with do justly. Justice has to do with the moral aspect. Love mercy, which has more to do with the relational aspect, but walk humbly with your God, which actually has everything to do with how, as we counsel individuals with these on either end, their humbleness and working in humbleness, working with them with humbleness will be key. So here are a few observations. Then I'm going to talk about how we can reach those individuals and counsel them. Overall, some observation: women tend to be more relational than men, because women, when we look at Eve, she was created for relationship. If we were to look at whoever's on the moral aspect, and if women are more on the moral processing side, they're typically not all the way over, but they because again, they're created to be a little bit more relational. However, women who are moral processors seem to have relational laws. And those relational laws have to do with, you should love me the way that I want. If you don't love me that way, it just doesn't count. It doesn't matter. And I remember counseling a woman who was very much like this. She was so black and white, very frustrating, because she didn't have the humility, unfortunately, to be able to hear and receive counsel. But she just said, this is how I need to be loved, and you need to love me that way. It's just that's it. And she was just so difficult to love. And he tried and he tried. So my heart went out to him. But most abusive spouses, again, are more extreme moral processors. Moral processing men may have relationship laws too, but tend to be more about respect and obedience, and you should do what I say and you should do what I think. Emotion, being abstract and confusing, again, can be funneled into a single emotion like anger. And most extreme processing is found from people who were raised in relationally detached homes. And I think this is can be a big thing, because again, we see there that a lot of us are probably somewhere, in the middle of all of that, or on either side. But if you were raised in a more relationally detached home, chances are you're further away in terms of your processing, not in terms of being a Christian, but in terms of processing, and that you have just a little bit further to move than maybe another person. Now, the whole aspect of this is because we're created in the image of God, but because sin has tainted us, that our moral aspect is tainted by sin, and it's by pride, or our relational aspect is tainted by sin and by pride. And so ultimately the goal is to become like Christ. And we see that in Romans 8:29, for those he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the likeness of Christ. So that's our destination. And the reason we want to be like Christ is because, again, he is the image of the invisible God. He is full of grace and truth. And he is the power and the wisdom of God. And essentially, that's kind of what we're looking at. We want to have the truth, we want to be loyal to truth and God's truth. We want to be loyal to grace, or we want to be able to give grace and receive grace. And for those on the moral side, it will be focusing on grace. For more on the relational side, we'll be focusing more on the truth. And we see at the bottom here, it says, as we're created in the image of God, yet tainted by sin, our goal is to become like Christ, who is the image of the invisible God, full of grace and truth. If our interpretive lenses lean toward New Testament grace, we must be sure that we're anchored in God's truth. Or if our interpretive lenses lean towards Old Testament law, we must understand and apply God's grace. So when looking at counseling, this here is the path to Christ likeness. So for the moral processor, again, it's all about the wisdom, because Jesus is about the wisdom of God. And so since moral processors typically look at things in terms of black or white, or right and wrong, and they see things, well, this is right, this is wrong. A lot of times it's not. A lot of times they're actually right in a lot of points that they make, but they're wrong in terms of how they're processing. And so we want to look at things and lead them towards, this is, you might be right in this, but let's look at this. Let's look at the wisdom of God's grace. So instead of looking at exactly 100% of what's right and wrong, we want to look at through the lens of wisdom of God's grace. So say, for example, we look at the account in Scripture of the adulterous woman. And when we look at that account, we see the fact is that this woman, according to law, deserved punishment. She deserved to be stoned. So they went to Jesus, and Jesus was not on the deserving system. He was the wisdom of God. And so he looked at that, that whole thing, the little letters in the sand or whatever he wrote there, and said, well, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone. And so then he goes to the woman and says, well, he who's the only one that could judge them decided not to judge, and instead extended mercy for her and said, go and sin no more. Now, yes, mercy is a little bit different than grace. We see that, but we see we see the wisdom of God through Jesus. And so we want to explain, we want to be able to share what grace is and what grace is not, and lead them through humility to be able to apply God's grace. So if we look, go through that little system there, if they don't have humility, it's going to be very difficult to get them from point A to point B, because they will always think that they're right. Again, depending on how far they are in that direction. and then the applying, being able to apply God's grace, so be able to understand it. So when we look here for counseling a moral processor, we explain the difference in processing. So we want to explain this model. We want to explain that they're a moral processor, or they have a moral interpretive lens, that this is how they see things. They'll probably agree with you. We want to listen and affirm what they're saying, but we want to look at wisdom over being right and wrong. Is that wise? What would a wise person do? We want to reinterpret how they're interpreted and challenge them in love and in grace. We want to counsel humility. And we want to always point to Jesus of the gospel. Now, that is really important too, because the moral processor will look at everything, and they'll see things as right and wrong. But Jesus was the fulfillment of the law. And so it's everything, and the fulfillment of the law isn't just obedience, but Jesus himself was that fulfillment. And how did he treat people? So we want to point them to Jesus of the New Testament, or rather of the gospel. And we want to be able to share accounts of how he responded, of how he treated people, and to be able to show them, to say that Jesus showed the relational part of God. And we need to move them in that direction of becoming like Christ, essentially. So when we look at the relational processor, it's kind of the same thing, but we're looking at focusing, instead of on God's grace, we're focusing more on God's truth. And we want to be able to show and share them, hey, this is God's truth, the wisdom. So if we're counseling someone who has struggles with identity or with worth, that's one of the things that we look at. So we want to look at, what is God's truth? And so are you going to base yourself on feelings, how you feel about yourself, or are you going to base yourself on the wisdom of God's truth? So obviously they need humility with that, because if they put their feelings over God's truth, then that's pride. That's being more right. That's a self-righteous aspect. And we want to move them then, again, to the application of God's truth. And we can do that through letters or journals, or, looking at scripture and memorizing scripture and things like that. So we want to do something very similar, right? We want to explain the differences in processing at times. Sometimes it's, you don't have to. Listen and affirm again. Again, go to that wisdom again. It's about God's wisdom, not our own feelings. Reinterpret and challenge, counsel humility. Now, sometimes we have to point to the Jesus, not the Jesus of the gospel, because the Jesus of the gospel is, a lot of people point to Jesus of the gospel and say, he's all about love, 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 love. So therefore, that's all it is. As a matter of fact, hell isn't even real, because Jesus is all about love, 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 love. Like, well, no, it's there's judgment in there too. So a lot of times we have to actually point to Jesus of Revelation. And we look at, no, Jesus actually is the judge, and he is going to, look at our hearts, and he is going to judge these things. And so it's really important that we look at that, we focus on that, and we also help them to apply these truths in their lives. So this essentially is kind of looking at that model of the image model, the I3 per se, and just kind of looking at how we generally will reflect God, and how we process things, how we interpret things will be through our interpretive lenses, which are going to be either more moral processing or more relational. And if we tend to be more of one than the other, then this is kind of how we want to help other people, or how we want to ourselves kind of look, so that we can move our clients closer. I have found this to be more helpful in marriage counseling, actually, because a lot of times when couples come to me, one is a little bit more of the moral, one is more of the relational, and helping them to see what exactly is going on, and how they're thinking things. And it really helps, especially when people are miscommunicating and they're like, how can you get this out of what I just said? And because that's really confusing to a lot of people, how someone can actually get to certain conclusions. And a lot of times they get to certain conclusions because of how they're processing, how their interpretive lenses are. And so this here then is just kind of that model to be able to, or a model to be able to kind of look at that and see that, hey, we all process things differently. It's not bad that we're processing things differently, but it's all tainted by sin. And so we essentially need Christ in order to become like Christ. We need the Holy Spirit, his wisdom. That's the wonderful counselor's wisdom, to be humble, to accept it, and apply God's truth to our life, so that we can become like Christ. And that essentially is an hour, and that is the model. Any questions? You can turn your mic back on for that.
Yeah, Fred, I like it. These are on slides. Can you send them like on a slide that we can use or print so that we can kind of have a tangible thing in front of people at times?
You want something tangible, Randy? Does that mean you're more of a moral processor?
That's my moral side coming out, yeah.
Yes, I'm going to send all of these slides to everybody.
Great.
So you can have that. I don't have any like worksheets per se on this, but at least I can send the slides to you and start from there. Good. Any other questions?
Yeah, Fred. Oh, pardon me. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say I often use a continuum with explaining things to kids I work with, so I like this. It kind of fits a lot of what I do already.
Sure. And that's something too that I can, like, if you have any other things, like I can meet with you personally and talk it over a few things and things like that too. So. Good,
yeah. So I like your overall presentation, Fred. I think the model makes a lot of sense, breaking down moral versus more relational processors, strengths and weaknesses, to help the other person see where they're at, where the other person's at, especially in the marriage context, as you mentioned. Just one thing that I didn't think was very clear is how the 3 I's of the model, how those actually fit together.
Yeah,
so
yeah, here it was in this slide that unfortunately you didn't see.
Okay, that could be because I was just in the same place as Randy was in terms of the slides weren't changing.
Yeah, I think everybody was, and I must have paused it so that it just stayed on the one slide, and my bad on that. But on this one, we see here that's being created in God's image, that we reflect the moral and relational, and that's reflected in how we interpret the world, which is an I, and how we interact with the world, which is an I. Or it could be impact too. I could do I4, but that's essentially kind of how that the image, takes place. It's through our interpretive lenses, essentially, and then how we interact.
And then you kind of touched on how sin affects the models, I think. I got the sense that it's sin enters in on the extremes of both sides. So is that correct? Is there more that you could say on that? And then the other question that I had was, how can a person move from one orientation to another?
I think the one question, yes, sin. What sin oftentimes does. Let me see if I can get sin affects our processing a little bit more. So the more that sin is there, and the more, which is a lot of pride, then the more likely we're going to probably become, if on this end, we'll probably become a little bit more relational, right? Or rather, I'm sorry, we'll become less relational, because sin has a lot to do with selfishness and self-centeredness. It has a lot to do with saying that I'm right, essentially. And so when looking at that, it does kind of move you a little bit further away in one respect. Now, and this has to do with the processing aspect. How we move to grow closer. Again, it has everything to do with that humility, where get back to this slide. Of being able to, look at the wisdom of God's grace, demonstrate humility, and understand this is how God wants us to be, and then move in this way. Again, this model is not going to be for everything that we counsel. It's going to be, at times, it's going to be very helpful. At times, it's just you don't even have to use it, kind of thing. So it's not like the heart model that you can almost use for everything. So I hope that answered your question a little bit.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Janet, I think you were supposed to mute your audio, Janet, but I think I think you can just speak because we hear you. We would hear you.
Wait, so do you hear my baby crying in the background?
Yeah. Yeah, we can hear your baby crying in the background.
We have to mute it.
Yeah, I think I asked people to mute it just before you hopped on. So, any other questions? So what I'm going to do is you're all going to get an email in a few minutes, and that'll just kind of be it's not a survey, but it's an end of the session review kind of thing. If you have any questions or thoughts, whether it's about the model or just about the program, that'll be helpful as I'm deciding whether or not to move forward with this program. And I will be forwarding the slides to you as well, so that you can take a look at it and just kind of go from there with everything.
That sounds great, Fred. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I know Janet has a question. Let's see. Are supposed to lack intimacy, but how does this fit into how we are made in the image of God? That's a great question, Janet. So black and white thinkers are supposed to lack intimacy, but how does this fit into how we are made in the image of God? I think this model has more to do with processing than everything. It's the sin nature inside, and so if it's the sin nature inside of the individuals, of course of knowing that they're right as well. So it's not that they are supposed to lack intimacy necessarily, but they often do lack intimacy. But this model is really more about the processing and what happens. And so intimacy in their mind is depending on how far you are. Again, less relational people tend to not need as much intimacy, but also depending on the background too. And so if they were, raised in a difficult environment, or abandoned, or adopted, I think sometimes for those who are adopted too, when they tend to be more towards the one direction, you just live life essentially, and intimacy is just not nearly as defined as it is with a relational processor. A relational processor, again, is more about thinking, like feelings, sharing dreams, sharing all of these different things. But for the more severe moral processor, they don't need to experience all that stuff for intimacy. Intimacy might just be sex, and that's it. Especially more for men than it is for women.
Right. I guess that makes sense. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because when I see somebody who's lacking intimacy, my mind goes back to, is it an unhealthy past? Was there trauma experienced, poor modeling, as opposed to a personality defect? Though I realize that our personalities can tend toward, one way or the other.
Right.
But that's where that was my only question regarding that. So I think that you explained that pretty well.
Yeah. Thank you again. And sometimes I think it, as most counselors being relational too, is that we hear the relational side of someone saying, they don't talk to me, they don't share their emotions, they don't do this, and it might be that the person is not necessarily cut out for all of that too, and might not just be able to do all that because again they just process things very, very differently. And I think if we're counseling someone who's more of a moral processor, I don't know if we need to say, well, you have to be this way, you have to share all your feelings so that your wife or your husband or whoever feels that a greater sense of intimacy. Sometimes I think there's an acceptance part too, on someone who might be more relational, as someone who's moral, to say, they're not going to be the deepest person. They're not going to meet you in the deepest places. And, will you accept that? It's not to say that they can't move. It's not to say that they can't improve or shouldn't improve. They absolutely should. But I don't think we should expect them to go all the way over to the other side either. So somewhere in there, there's some truth in there.
I have one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you touched on this briefly, and it has to do with emotional abusers,
Yeah.
which is my specialty. So my question is this, because if I'm counseling a couple and one of the partners is very critical toward their spouse, they lack intimacy, they're very right and wrong, and they're very strong in that, one of the things I'm going to look for is emotional abuse.
Right.
Because those are tickets, signals for that. And
Yes.
what I wouldn't want to do is to label someone an emotional abuser if this is for a personality defect that they lack that kind of discipleship, to understand grace, receive it.
Right.
So I guess, I feel like I have my definition of emotional abuse, but how would you separate the two? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know if I've ever pointed to someone and said you're an emotional abuser, but I certainly have defined and certainly have stated that this is emotional abuse, and even though that they might process things differently, it's really the pride inside and the lack of humility inside that's really really bringing that about. And so ultimately, it's kind of looking at the pride as well. So they might still process things as right and wrong, black and white, but by the introduction of grace and the focus of grace and helping them see that I understand that you process things this way, but understand that you processing this way without Christ and the way that Christ is, and only looking at the Bible as a bunch of laws is not going to work for you. So now it's about what is wise at this point, not just what is right and wrong, it's what is wise for you to do. So it's not wise for you to continue what you're doing if you want to become closer to Christ, if you want to keep your relationship, because even the moral processors, they want relationships. They desire relationships. They're just not very good at it. The more extreme they are, the more extreme. Again, my wife she's more the moral processor, but she's also very, pretty relational too. And and I think, and a lot of that is her humility, just being able to listen. And, but she also came from a very good background where her family was very relationally intact too. So I think that was very helpful.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, no, great questions. All right. If there aren't any more questions, then again, thank you all. And I will go ahead and ship this information out to you. And appreciate if you can fill out those surveys and get that back when they're emailed to you. That would be awesome.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you and appreciate all that you do for Foundations.
Likewise. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. And let's see how to do this. And training for all. Yes. Okay.